Good morning, everyone. We're going to give this just a minute or two more to make sure that we've got everyone joined in, and then we'll get started. All right, hopefully we've got everyone here. I don't want to delay too long because we're really anxious to hear what our speaker has to say today. I want to welcome you. My name is Joanne Vieira, and I'm the Director of Horticulture for the trustees here in Massachusetts. And we're really thrilled to have you joining us for our 5th annual Public Gardens Winter Lecture, which is hosted by our Public Gardens Advisory Committee. I know many of you are familiar with the work of the trustees, but for those of you who are new to us, the trustees is the nation's oldest and Massachusetts' largest conservation and preservation nonprofit. We were founded in 1891 by landscape architect Charles Eliot to preserve for public use and enjoyment properties of exceptional scenic, historic, and ecologic value in Massachusetts. Today, we protect and preserve 123 properties across the state, and we invite everyone to enjoy these places, to connect with nature, and to join us in our effort to preserve these places for everyone for all time. In addition to these 123 properties that comprise over 27,000 acres, we also preserve over 20,000 acres in conservation restrictions in collaboration with property owners. Amongst all the 123 wonderful properties that we hold, we have 12 properties with such exceptional garden or landscape design, with well-documented and diverse plant collections and other cultural assets which distinguish them as public gardens. It's these 12 properties that the Public Garden Advisory Committee, many of whom are joining us today, have been so instrumental in supporting and guiding. These 12 gardens are sprinkled across the state of Massachusetts, from Castle Hill in Ipswich to My Toy on Martha's Vineyard, all the way west to Stockbridge, where Fletcher Steele and Mabel Choate's masterpiece garden, Namkeg, is located. There are 9 other gardens sprinkled in between those locations. These gardens are living examples of the history of horticulture in Massachusetts. They're diverse in their designs, in the complexity of their plant collections, in their soils, the hydrology, the geology, their climate zones. They provide us with a powerful opportunity to study the effects of these factors on plants and to prepare these gardens for the changing climate and the future ahead of us. They also provide us a wonderful opportunity to share their cultural riches and the lessons that we learn from this experimentation with many audiences. In the last several years, we've worked to revitalize many of these gardens. Major restoration projects at Castle Hill and Namkeg have transformed those flagship properties and brought new energy and excitement to them. Similar work has been completed at Stevens Coolidge House and Garden in North Andover, where new gardens were created side by side with existing gardens, and new visitor amenities were added to the property to really elevate the experience there. This work is underway at Long Hill in Beverly, where I'm located today. And a wonderful new garden has been created here at the top of the hill, and a new learning campus is currently, actually right at the moment, being constructed at the bottom of the hill. And there's much, much more to come in our gardens statewide. None of this would be possible without the support of our membership, without our donor support, and without the guidance of our Public Garden Advisory Committee. We're really fortunate today to have Elizabeth de Montresard here. She's the chair of the Public Gardens Advisory Committee, and she will introduce our speaker today. Before I hand it over to Elizabeth, I just want to remind you that we will have a question and answer session at the end of the presentation, and we invite you to use the question and answer button at the bottom of your screen to type in your questions, which we'll address at the end. Thank you so much. Elizabeth?
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much, Joanne. And good morning, everyone. It is my sincere pleasure to welcome with us today the esteemed Dr. Alexandra Daisy Ginsberg. So I wish I could see you all, But the great thing about the technology is that we get to access talent all the way in the UK. So Daisy, again, thank you for coming today. Dr. Ginsberg, you're absolutely spellbinding art that pushes the limits between nature, synthetic biology, AI, and evolution is so innovative, unique, and important. We are all excited to learn from you today about your process and how your art examines nature and human nature. Dr. Ginsberg's work of powerful storytelling of the natural world and the investigation into the human's impulse to better the world is such a vital and, well, so relevant story to tell today. Dr. Ginsberg, we would love for you to lead us through a discussion of your practice, and in particular, your commission for the pollinators of the Eden Project in Cornwall. Daisy, again, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be with you all, albeit virtually. I hope everyone's taking advantage of having their cameras off and drinking their coffee. So I'm going to tell you about what I've been working on for the last couple of years, and it's a very different approach to the creation of gardens. So let me start with some context. So some of you may have been to this place or know of it. It's called the Eden Project in Cornwall in the UK. And it's a really extraordinary ecological attraction. It's quite different from a botanic garden, but inside these biomes are rainforests, Mediterranean and temperate climates, and collections of plants. But the idea of the place is very different to the sort of colonial collection of the botanic garden. And that's really the starting point for this. Over the last few years, I've been making a lot of work that explores our relationship with extinction, with colonialism, biodiversity loss. And the opportunity to work with Eden was very exciting for me for a number of reasons. And one of them was their agenda. So Eden's aim is to connect visitors with the natural world, to give them a sense of awe and the sense of connection, and also to alert them to the jeopardy facing the natural world. But there are two other bits of their mission that really fascinated me as an artist, and that was to instill hope and agency in the visitor. And I've been putting work in museums. Some of the pieces that I've exhibited recently include a reconstruction of the northern white rhino, of which there are only 2 females left, or a piece that's actually coming to Boston in a few months at the MIT Museum, which involves the reconstruction of an extinct flower's smell. But these are pieces that sit in a museum and really sort of engender a feeling of loss in the visitor. And I was really excited about this idea of agency. So that's just some context. But the crucial thing of this commission was that it was to make an artwork about pollinators. So it was part of a larger program at the Eden Project to bring attention to the jeopardy facing pollinators. And this is a worldwide problem. In Germany, I think 70% of pollinating insects have been lost in the last 30 years. Like, numbers are crashing around the world. And what was interesting about this commission was that it was going to be outdoors for at least 5 years, funded by a UK foundation called the Garfield Weston Foundation as part of this bigger program. And there was this delicious piece of land, which is marked in green here, which was available for the installation. It's 55 meters long. And I thought, well, this is really crazy. Why are we making something about pollinators? Instead, let's make an artwork for them. There's this opportunity, there's money, let's not waste it on metal and sort of steel structures. Instead, let's plant plants. And as I started to research pollinators, and I think there's several important caveats here, is one, I'm not a gardener. And so this has been a real journey through the pandemic for me. And the second is I'm not a pollinator expert, I'm not a pollination scientist. And this is the way I approach all my works, is coming at it as an amateur and then getting to work with experts by persuading them it's a good idea and learning more and sort of synthesizing all these different approaches together. So as I started to research pollinators, what struck me first of all is this very basic fact that had never occurred to me, was that they see differently to us. So for example, on the left is the way we see a flower, and on the right is a simulation of the same, I think it's a pelargonium, through a bee's eye view. Now, bees can't see red, they see green and blue and UV. And so you'll notice on the right-hand image that, well, obviously the leaves appear a different color, but there's also markings on the flower that are invisible to us, but they sort of direct the insect into the flower. So what's really extraordinary about this is if you start to think about looking at a garden that you've planted for yourself, what are the actual users of this garden and what are they seeing? So again, on the right-hand side is a simulation of how a bee might see a field of bluebells. Now, this isn't just bees seeing differently to humans. Butterflies see differently to bees because they can see green, blue, and UV, but they can also see red, but it sort of differs from species to species. So when you think of how we perceive the world, it's really just one way of looking at it. And so, especially in the context of gardens, when you think who's really meant to be using them, well, the insects and plants are experiencing it differently. And it's not just color, it's also depth. So in the top row of this diagram is how we see these plants, and what you see as you move further away, so from 2 centimeters down to 14 centimeters in the bottom 3 rows, is how a bee, as they move further away from the flower, no longer can see what we see. So they have less good eyesight in some ways, but they also have better eyesight in other ways because they can see polarized light, which helps them navigate. And they also have a higher flicker threshold. So when when we drive past a field of flowers, that's a blur to us, but to a bee, they're better at identifying individual flowers. And there's also really extraordinary things about how these insects are traveling. So bees and some other species can follow trap lines, and that means that they memorize the locations of the flowers that they visit. And they may visit 10,000 flowers in a day. So being able to find the fastest route between those flowers and remember it and go back and follow that route the next day when the nectar has replenished is really important as a way of saving energy. And scientists study the ways by putting tiny little radars on the backs of bumblebees, tracking how they repeat the same journey over and over again. So all of this was just so inspiring to me and led me to this question: well, if pollinators design gardens, what would humans see? And this to me was a way to shift the perspective and to really, I would say, put myself in pollinator's shoes, but obviously they don't wear shoes, but to flip the way we understand a garden. Who do we plant gardens for? Who are we actually designing for? And if it's not for ourselves, what does it mean to create these kinds of spaces? So the original proposals was in April 2020, which was a strange time to be thinking creatively. I created this drawing, and this was part of the proposal, was for a garden that would be designed by an algorithm as a way to buffer my aesthetic choices in the design and actually create something that's ultimately for pollinators. And this is what we managed to do. So I'm going to take you through the process now. This was another painting I did, trying to explain before we'd actually made this algorithm what this kind of garden might look like. So there's influences from the naturalistic meadow style that amazing designers like Pete Rudolph propagate, but there's also a strange randomness in here where we can't really control what's going on. So I'm going to now move on to the kind of process behind this, and for those who are gardeners here, you may be horrified, and that's really is the idea. So to create an algorithm to design gardens sounded like a very sensible idea at the beginning, and then I realized that I would have to do this. And an algorithm is essentially just a recipe. It's a set of instructions, and you can create a set of rules, but you need to have the top rule. What is this algorithm doing? And I was collaborating with a wonderful computer scientist and string theory physicist, Dr. Przemek Wityczek, who was very game for this process, but again, not a garden designer. So we had to really break down this problem through research and through, in a way, the benefits of coming at it without prior knowledge. So I had to come up with the top rule for the algorithm, and I suggested that we could create an algorithm that makes the most empathetic garden possible, the most empathy for other species. And then we have to define that. So I decided, well, we'll define it by deciding that empathy means creating a garden that always supports the maximum pollinator species possible. So what that then means is you've got, this is what we want to come out the back of the algorithm, but what are we going to put in the front? So what then transpired was many months of research, collecting information on different plants from a number of different sources, contacting pollination experts, horticultural experts, working with the experts at Eden. And what we needed to do was to build a palette. So it's essentially a database, a list of about 155 plants in the end that we could actually verify the pollinators that visited each plant. So here are 4 examples from the database, and I created paintings, and you'll see why in a little bit of each of these plants. So for example, the Aster Amaryllis King George, we know that it suits honeybees, bumblebees, solitary bees, hoverflies, other flies, butterflies, beetles, moths. But if you look at the Jerusalem sage on the right-hand side, it's really specialized, and it's visited by bumblebees. And there's some plants that are even more specialized. The long-tongued bumblebee will have a relationship with a particular plant, for example. And the reason that we have what we call these generalists on the left and these specialists on the right is because plants and their pollinators have co-evolved over millions of years to have these kinds of relationships. And what you'll also see in these lists, these are really the kind of the key bits of information that we needed to find out for each plant, was the height and the conditions it likes. But another key element is when it blooms. And again, it had never occurred to me, and maybe I'd be very curious if anyone else is in the dark like I was. It never occurred to me that different plants come out at different times of the year, because that's when their pollinators emerge. I never really thought that that was why it was. And obviously the question is it the pollinators leading the dance, or is it the plants leading the dance? But it's a co-evolutionary relationship. So when we start to build this database, we were having to consider that there are enough plants to suit all the different pollinator categories that we'd built, that we knew there were plants that would emerge over different seasons of the year. And that is actually an interlinked problem, because we know what, when the pollinators emerge, when the seasons of those flowers are emerging, and then which pollinator groups. There's actually things that we don't think about. For example, the wispiness of a plant, the permeability of how it looks. And that's also the study of scientific research, how pollinators are perceiving space, how they find where they're going to. These are all really interesting ways to think about how you design gardens. So in the end, what we did was create this very tightly curated list of plants that can live together, plants that can suit different kinds of garden conditions. So in the database, there have to be enough for clay soil, enough for sandy soil, enough for sunny spots, partially sunny spots, shady spots, for example. And it's this huge sort of jigsaw puzzle to solve. And then with that, we could start to design this algorithm. And the algorithm is always trying to solve for suiting the most pollinator species, and whichever way you play with it, it will do that for you. And I'm going to jump out of this presentation and just show you how it works, because it's much more fun to show you directly. I'm going to talk more about this website in a bit, but let's get started. So you can see my screen, I hope. Someone will ping me, I think, if you can't. So the way it works to design a garden is you essentially just like give the size of the plot. We can maybe cut out some edges, and we are going to choose, I think I'm going to have loamy soil. It's going to be quite neutral, sunny conditions, and it will be sheltered. And now is the bit where we get to play with the algorithm. So because the algorithm is always designing for the maximum number of pollinators, however we play with any of these different parameters, it's going to come up with a solution that's balancing out that list to make sure the bumblebees, the butterflies, the long-tongued bumblebees, the moths, the wasps all have something to forage on. So I can choose to have, it's a bit bigger, you can see it's better, to have more or fewer plant species in my garden. I'm going to go for more. I can have a bolder pattern or a more intricate pattern, and whichever way I choose, again, it will balance it out. And I can choose to give a few more flight paths, so those routes that bumblebees and different kinds of bees memorize, or to offer more patches for beetles and other foragers who sort of randomly fly about and hit stuff as they travel to find forage. So now I'm going to press create my garden, and depending on the internet connection, the time will vary as the algorithm tries to come up with a garden design. So you can be doing this at home as well at the same time. I'm just going to turn off this. So there is a soundtrack, which is, I don't think it played very well over Zoom, but what you can see here is a garden in the early summer, which I can start to fly through. And these are all the paintings that I created of each plant. So what is unusual about this as a garden design tool is that for a start, I can see how it's going to look over the seasons as this garden transforms. I can fly in it to get the pollinator view. And there's points for anyone who can identify these plants at this speed. And there's other things that I can do which are quite fun, is I can turn on the pollinator vision button down here on the left. And again, sort of create a simulation, but of course it's so much more complex than this. But the idea is to show that the way we're perceiving space and the garden itself is just, it's not reality, it's just our version of reality. Now I can also see the garden. I've just gone into the aerial view, so I can start to see patterns emerging. And I'm going to talk a bit more about the patterns in a moment, but just show you this one here. Across the seasons, you start to see what's in bloom and what's coming up later in the year. If I just go back to the 3D view again, what's also really handy is I can see the plant names, and I can go back to these records and actually find out who's pollinating what. And I'm going to come back to this in a bit. I'm just going to go back to the presentation because there's more fun to be had. So these are the rules that we built the database on. It's choosing different shaped flowers for different shaped mouth parts, which is a brilliant quote by one of our advisors, Mark Carlton. And so a way to think about that is, daisies have, very open and accessible, which is why many pollinators visit, whereas foxgloves have these deep tubes, which are suitable for long-tongued bumblebees. I mentioned the plant species that flower across the seasons. We've included a lot of species in this perennial list, which keep seed heads over winter and provide habitat. And I know that these questions are going to come up about are we using local plants? We instead chose to include non-native plants, but we described this list as locally appropriate. And I can talk more about that if there's questions, but we decided that this is really an unnatural garden. It's a synthetic creation, but it's designed for nature. And so as long as the plants are appropriate, it doesn't matter really where they've come from, as long as they're not invasive or problematic. And we also had to choose plants that was close to the natural type, or if there are cultivars that have research that shows that they're still good for pollinators. So we had to, because there's so little research on garden plants, it's really difficult to find verified data on which pollinators visit which plants. So we worked with our experts, with research we could find, and various other online resources to try and verify these lists. But in general, moving away from the cultivars, where often they're bred for human aesthetics, not pollinator aesthetics, is a good rule to follow. So I showed you one garden in the visualizer, but I just want to show this different scheme where we have a really different kind of pattern emerging. And these are some of the trap lines that the algorithm has created, sort of supermarket sweeps for bumblebees or bees that follow trap lines to follow one kind of plant. But we can't control what the algorithm does. Like, here's another one emerging. So in a way, it's like a game of like a fruit machine. You keep on pulling it, so you never necessarily get quite what you want. But that's what's really interesting about it, is you're not in control. This is not for the human gardener. So again, just showing what a pattern like that starts to look like. It's a really different way, I think, of creating a garden design. We still have these strong drift patterns in here, but the flower choices, that the height mix may not be what you would necessarily choose. And this is the same scheme in 3D. So when we did user testing, I was volunteering at a charity-run garden near where I live, and most of the volunteers are sort of retired gardeners and very, very, very skilled, sort of retired amateur gardeners. They're not, but very, 30, 40 years of gardening experience. And one of the group was saying, well, that's all very well, but I have a list of plants I want to use and I know where I want to put them. I was saying, well, with this, you just don't get to choose. It's not about you, Pam. It's about the pollinators. And it's really interesting, that sense of wanting to control. And I have the same thing. We've just been designing a new, very large garden that's going into Hyde Park in London. And every scheme, we generated maybe 200 schemes trying to find the perfect one. And that there is no perfect one, because there's things that you wouldn't necessarily put together from a human perspective. But we have to be looking at it from the perspective of a beetle or a butterfly or a moth. And so, talking to the team at Royal Parks, I was asking them to evaluate by giving them each an insect to be to perform the evaluation. So I'm going to move now onto what happens next. So I've talked about the insects themselves and the creation of the schemes, and now it's time to dig. And what's also really kind of at the heart of this project is thinking about how artworks are commissioned and finding the same level of empathy and generosity in this model. So in the art world, things, scarcity matters. So if you're creating an editioned artwork, the smallest number of editions of that artwork makes the art more valuable. So if there's one painting, it's much more valuable than if there's 100 identical ones. But what's different with these kinds of pollinator artworks is that the more there are, the more successful the artwork is, because pollinators are flying between them. So we need to have a lot of these gardens. And we're using the language of the art world, of editioning, as a way to kind of to really explore this idea of asking, who is an artwork for, who is a garden for, who do we design for? And if it's not for us, is it really possible to have this altruistic model where we're creating for other species? So at the heart of the project is this sort of complex life cycle, which is really fundamental to the future success. We launched this project in November, and it's sort of kicking off with physical sites this year. So it starts with the plant palettes, which I've described, and the one that's available on the website now is not yet suitable for the US. It's for the UK and Northern Europe mostly. But we're creating a new one for the Berlin region and sort of continental Europe is coming later this year. So that plant palette feeds into the algorithm, and the algorithm, as we saw, creates these new designs. Each time there's a new addition garden created, like the one we're doing at Eden, and we're going to be doing more, the next one's in Hyde Park, and then we're doing one in Berlin. When they're in a new region, we commission a new plant list, and that new plant list enables the next part of the project to happen. So I showed you a little bit of the website, and I'm going to show you some more of it in a moment. The website itself allows anyone to play with this tool. And if your region is available, you can create your own garden designs for free for non-commercial use, and print a PDF with planting instructions for free. And we invite you to plant it as a DIY edition. So the idea is that as we have these larger edition gardens, we start to create hubs of DIY gardens around them in new networks. So with the Berlin launch, we hope that we'll see more Berlin DIY gardens emerging. So I'll just skip through this. So the first garden is at Eden, and there's me showing that I'm a beginner gardener. So we planted it in September, and it's going to open formally in May this year. So really exciting to see. This is a quite fuzzy drone shot of this garden. So it's 7,000 plants over 55 meters. And it's on this very, very steep slope. And it's going to be very exciting to see what it looks like. So from the bowl of the Eden pit, it's really like a billboard. So it's going to hopefully be this super bright fluorescent sort of billboard for pollinators on the side of the pit. The next garden, edition 2, will actually be planted, I think, now in May, and will open in September in Berlin. And we're preparing to plant in Hyde Park in a few weeks, which is very exciting, for the Serpentine, and will open in June. So at the core of this project is this art-led campaign, and using this idea of creative activism to get people involved, to create, in a way, what's the like a different kind of engagement with the pollinator crisis. So I'm just going to jump back to the website, and I will show you where this leads to next. So this was the garden I created before for you. If I now click on planting instructions here in the bottom right, what I get is a PDF. And in this PDF is my unique edition number for my garden. So the big gardens are edition 1, 2, 3, unlimited editions. And the DIY ones have these strange little numbers. And it means you can revisit and fly through it as many times as you want back on the website. And you may have been scratching your head over NFTs. I have been scratching my head over NFTs over the last couple of years, because they seem to me to be very strange ways to engage with the world, creating a link to a thing that I can't touch, but I own, and it's just using electricity to experience it. So this is using electricity to create artworks, but the whole thing is just a platform, a tool to really get gardens in the ground. And in a way, it's the anti-NFT is how I like to think about it, because yes, here I've got my URL, but I don't have to pay for it. And the real cost, if I want to pay, is buying plants or finding a patch of land to plant. So in here we have some information, and this is really aimed at the beginner gardener, but all the way through to the experienced gardener. So I mentioned Pam before at the garden I volunteer at, and what was really interesting to me, and my father is a very enthusiastic topiarist, and we argue a lot about the idea of control, as he sort of tortures plants into submission, into beautiful shapes. And the idea of not being able to control the garden process, I think, is very interesting for the experienced gardener. And I'd love to hear more about your thoughts on that. So what you end up with is this crazy looking planting by numbers grid, which also is a very different way of planting a garden. And it tells you exactly where everything goes. This is a 15-meter garden, so it's a lot of plants. And underneath is a grassy matrix, and this isn't in the visualizations. And the purpose of this is to really provide habitat as well. So we have different grasses that have been allocated within the scheme, and they reduce the need for weeding and also provide habitat over the winter months for different species, not just pollinators, but other animals as well. So you get a plant list, and part of the challenge is sourcing these plants. So how many plants to order of each? And again, what's really key about this is that there are different ways to do this. So for the beginner gardener, you can buy plants that makes you more confident of 9-centimeter plants, but you can also turn this into a whole project and start with seeds, propagating your own seeds into plugs and get planting. So we're working on developing lesson plans and ways that schools can potentially engage with this as well. So the other part is this DIY garden thread, and at the moment I am the first one, but I knew about it, so I planted in October, just before the winter, and I can just show you some of the first little signs of life emerging in my DIY garden. So that was it in October, and my primroses just came out last week, so I was very excited. On the left is a little screenshot of my visualization of it, and I can be certain that those are primroses from it. So that was very exciting for me. And the ambition here is to create the world's largest climate positive artwork together. And I have no idea if we will achieve this. And in a way, part of the question is, have we already achieved it? Are there any climate positive artworks? So I started describing how, as an artist, I ship art around the world and have artworks about extinction and biodiversity and the terrifying climate crisis, climate emergency that we all face, and I show them in museums, and I'm part of the problem, and the art world is part of that problem. We are shipping things around. And what does it mean to actually make something climate positive? We've chosen this phrase rather than carbon negative, because again, that's quite a confusing term. There's also carbon positive, which often is interchangeable with carbon negative. But even as we think about gardening, I think there's a lot of questions, and this is research that we're planning to do, is to think about, is gardening good for the environment? And I know from ordering those plants and putting in my first garden, the amount of energy that was used in shipping plants. I gave away all the plant pots that plants came in, but there's a huge amount of energy and waste in that process as well. And for me, there's a particular fascination with the idea of being able to create an entire installation from an envelope of seeds. And it's a very different way of thinking about installing large-scale artworks. The whole thing could just come in an envelope in the post. And that was really an idea that came out of the pandemic, as we were obviously locked away at home. And there was this moment where in the UK, garden centres were closed. Seeds were very hard to come by, as everyone felt the need to try and connect with nature as much as possible. And in that was this realization that, and I think it's especially important now as well, as energy prices soar, that there's something very clever about nature, that seeds are so small and they travel, and pollen travels, and all these things can travel around, and we can actually help make these much larger impacts from very small material. I think what's really the kind of crucial part, and again, it's really good for sort of topic for discussion perhaps, is the very privileged nature of this project. It's still, there's a lot of goodwill, and there are a lot of challenges that we want to address with this project, but most people don't have gardens. And to try and create an inclusive artwork for something that's very exclusive is in itself problematic. there is this interesting thread, or important thread, I think, of creative activism that runs through it. That the idea of you don't have a garden and you want to make this happen, and you can go to your school or community space and fight for a change of use of a piece of land, a disused roundabout or a motorway verge. These are all good sites for this kind of work, but to make that change happen requires effort and fundraising and getting volunteers together. And that's, you know, what creative activism could be described as. But that's the bit we need help to solve as well. And making this accessible to people is really important. So on the website at pollinator.arts, there are instructions on how you can scale it down as well into plant pots, and to reduce the scale of the gardens from these 50 centimeter pixels. And I think the last thing I will say before we kind of get into discussion is that maybe some of you are getting really excited about this. I hope so. We want to do a US plant list, and a Northeastern region plant list will probably be where we begin. But we need people to get on board and get excited to help us make that happen. But in the meantime, I'm going to create one more garden for you, just to show you that every time it is different. So let's get started again. So this is the drop-down list, but these are actually all the same database. Different, very different conditions, sunny and sheltered. And let's go for lots of plant species, a bolder pattern, and more paths. And let's see what we get. A lot of echiums, which are, I would call them skyscrapers for pollinators. And so Echium pinnata. And here's some of the Carina poppy, which I love, and these wonderful heleniums. And you can see how this garden changes. Sedum. So I'll leave you with this crazy looking garden in your minds across the seasons.
Thank you, Daisy. We do have some questions for you today. And again, for the audience, if you'd like to submit any questions, you can do so via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So to start, is or will Eden be open to the public, and when?
So it's already open. Let me just show you, I can show you some small pictures on here. So it's opened, we planted it, and it's sort of open to the public. People can walk along here, but it's going to be in its first blooming season this spring, and it's going to be a formal opening at the end of May this year. But I last saw it a few weeks ago, and it kind of looked a bit like this still, but it's coming soon.
Wonderful. What is the minimal size of a garden that helps pollinators? Would a goal be to create pollinator garden corridors so that pollinators can have a large range?
Yes, that's such a great question. So I think even one flower is good for a pollinator who's hungry. Obviously, having plants, what's interesting about this is maybe a descendant of the herbaceous border, is that it's a super concentrated glut of forage. What we want to do, and I mentioned the idea of having more additions near each other, DIY additions or the big gardens, matters because it's the movement between these sites that's so important. So we're going to be doing research with the University of Exeter in the UK, looking at this in a landscape scale. So the garden we're planting in Hyde Park, in Kensington Gardens in Hyde Park in London for the Serpentine, is actually going to be over 250 meters, and it's 11 discrete beds. And so there's a good place that we'll be able to study the movement between beds, because bumblebees may travel 4 kilometers, honeybees may travel 1 kilometer, hoverflies are only flying 200 meters, and sort of ants and beetles staying much closer to where they start out. I think ants really within a few meters. So thinking about this on a landscape scale is what we want to do. And to do that, we need people to get planting and to help us. So create corridors.
Great. Over time, other non-native, non-pollinator friendly plant species will join in based on seeds that spread through the air and via animals. How does this change over time connect to your vision and goals?
So I'm rereading the question every time. But that's, I think like non-native, non-pollinator friendly are different categories. So there's wind, we've got grasses in here, which are, as I mentioned, are there to provide habitat and ground cover, but they're wind pollinated, but they're still pollinator friendly because they provide a place to live. For Eden, I think this is answering the question, but let me know, Andrea, if this isn't right, that we are kind of keeping our maintenance strategy open for the moment. We want to see what happens. So a garden may tend to monoculture if it's left itself with, you know, the most competitive plant winning out. And here we're hoping that it's so densely packed that the plants that we've chosen can sort of live together well. But we want to see whether we let it wild itself over the 5 years or how tightly we maintain it. And that's going to be part of the fun, actually. So in the resources section on the website, in the how to plant, there's a guide to maintenance. In a way, it's open to the user. Like flowers are good if they're the right kind of flowers. If they're not, cultivars that are, you know, sort of like a pedigree dog that just looks good but aren't very useful. I have a cavapoo, so I can't really talk.
Okay. Would you please go over again how we can support the creation of regional plant lists for Massachusetts?
So what we need to do, the way this model works is so here it explains that we have these commissioned gardens. And what a commissioned garden is, it's one of these big ones like we're doing in Eden or in Berlin and in Hyde Park. The one in Berlin, we have an arts institution working with the Natural History Museum in Berlin as scientific partner, and we establish a local advisory committee of different pollinator experts and horticultural experts who help build this bigger list. And so that's what we need to do in the US, is to find a commissioner and create a scientific advisory committee and to fund basically this a research project. So it's a philanthropic exercise to begin with, and then finding partners to get involved. So in Berlin, we were really lucky that the Natural History Museum was already partnered with this arts organization, and they assembled this amazing committee. And I'm just finishing up the drawings now for the Berlin list, which will go online in May. And then, yeah, hopefully but this is also a question for all of you, is that I heard like this question about natives, that the rumors that I hear is that that's much more important in the US as an approach to gardening styles. So I think this will be one of the questions as we create plant lists for different regions, is how specific do we have to get within a region? You know, would a New York City list be different from a New York State list, or a Massachusetts list be very different from a New York State list? Or would there be particular plants that are really important to include? For Cornwall, I was really insistent on including the Echium pinnata, these tall, towering plants that are from the Canary Islands, but are very common to see in Cornwall. And in a way that's part of the Cornish plant architecture alongside the heathers that we also included. So there was part of it was storytelling for the region as well. But yes, get in touch if you're excited. We want to do it. We want to do this for the US.
Wonderful. Will coastal conditions, let's say between 5 to 10 miles from the ocean, bring about different palettes of plants and pollinators?
Oh, it's a really good question. So, I mean, we were talking with Pompeii at one point about doing an archaeobotanical list, so a historic list of plants that might have been more prevalent at the time of the loss of Pompeii. And the reason I say that is that there's the capability to do much more specific kinds of lists. But again, I mean, it's a research project in itself. So we could make sub-lists for very particular regions. But when we make a list, what's really important as part of this philanthropic approach is that we match it up to all the potential conditions. So it's not just making a list for a particular location, so that's sunny with a sandy soil. It also has to include plants that are good for, you know, your neighbor's shady garden down the road, to create this kind of complete list that then gets donated to the website. But yes, they can get very specific. Historic plants of Pompeii is also like a good case study.
Wonderful. In your pollinator garden if your pollinator garden is in a context surrounded by trees and shrubs, does that have any effect on the pollinator's path reaching your plants?
Oh, I think I would defer to an expert on that. I mean, we are, the garden in Hyde Park is on a really complicated site that has a lot of trees in it and existing bits of vegetation, and some already sort of wildflower inoculated areas of lawn. So it'll be really interesting. And this is part of what we want to study with our partners at Exeter, is to map routes. But if you're interested in pollinator paths, these scientists to look at, you can see a bit more on this How It Works page. Lars Chitka, so I just zoom in on this, is a scientist at Queen Mary's University in London, and he spends time putting radars on the backs of bumblebees, and his work is totally fascinating. He was one of our advisors. So if you want to get in depth, I recommend reading his work. It's super fascinating.
Thank you. We just have time for a couple more questions here. Can you tell us about what other pollinators are currently doing that you have found in your research, and how your 3 gardens are different in the final product versus other pollinators' gardens?
Could you, I was looking for that. Who asked the question? I just want to read. So could you read it again?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yes. Can you tell us about what other pollinators are currently doing that you have found in your research, and how your 3 gardens are different in the final product versus other pollinators' gardens?
So how is this different from other gardens? I think ultimately, I mean, the question that I'm scared to answer through scientific research is this better than existing pollinator-friendly gardening? And in a way, it doesn't really matter, because this is an artistic project, it's not a scientific project, and it's informed by science, but it's not a scientific experiment. But that said, I'm really keen that we study it to see if it is effective. And one study we want to do is to compare it in Hyde Park with the Royal Parks Biodiversity team, to look at existing planting in the park and do pollinator counting, look at existing wildflower pollinator-friendly planting in the park, and to look at ours. And I expect ours will perform well, because it's just got such an abundance of plants, and the algorithm is calculating blooming across the seasons. So there's just good amount of forage. We're choosing quite different schemes. So in Berlin, we don't yet have the site confirmed, but in Hyde Park, we've gone for very different, well, actually, we're down to the final 2 schemes, and we're looking at plant availability now. But one of them is very different to what we did at Eden. So Eden, we chose something that's much stripier in a way, that came out of the generator. So you can sort of see it in this image here. Has some very strong bands in the plan, and and what we did, the scheme that we chose in the Serpentine appeared, it's a very different kind of plot, and so we got a lot more of these track lines appeared, these sort of donuts, interlinking donuts. So I'm hoping that we end up with that scheme. So they may look really different, and that's also really, something I'm excited about. And what else are pollinators doing that's that's interesting? Was that the question? I mean, like they're just super fascinating beings. But what, I didn't quite understand that bit of the question.
Oh yes, it was the 3 gardens are different in the final
Yeah.
product versus the pollinator gardens, and what are they currently doing that you found in your research? Just tell us.
They're just being awesome.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, they can see polarized light. They can see UV. They're just amazing. They're living their whole, life cycle in all these different ways within here. I mean, there's questions we've had from the scientists we're going to do the research with. Should we also be putting in stone walls for some masonry bees and different kinds of habitats within here to provide habitat for all these different kinds of species? The site at Eden did have a beehive on it to begin with, and we've actually moved the beehive because I didn't know, because I'm not a beekeeper, that bees poo outside their hive, and so they won't forage directly next to it. So we've actually relocated the hive some distance away. I think there's, for me, a real part of the learning experience of this has been, as a non-expert, not realizing how many different organisms were pollinators, and that even wasps are pollinating. And so creating a garden that can explain that it's not just bees, and to remove this important hyper focus on bees, but actually zoom out and think about all these other species that need supporting as well.
Thank you. That was excellent. And we have time for one final question today. Which location from the drop-down list is most similar to New England in designing a garden?
Okay. So the drop-down list is actually all one list. So that's the secret sauce that I've just revealed. But then we're going to be adding on new regions, and we broke it down because there is a recommendation. So if you go into the resources and find out more, and the help that you do need to check what you're planting. So you could create a scheme here, and then you would need to kind of, it's your own research project to look at what's suitable and what's not for the region. I think a lot of the plants that we've used are common in this European naturalistic style. That's also, you can see it on the High Line in New York, or the Lurie Gardens in Chicago. And we haven't done this work yet to see how much is similar, but I imagine there are species in here that would carry over. But we would be, to create this list, we would be looking also at different pollinator groups. We don't have hummingbirds in the UK, so you'd have more red flowers, perhaps, because birds see red. Anyway, so it's a whole, please undertake the research and create a plant list on the site and see if things look familiar to you or not.
Well, thank you so much, Daisy, for answering all those questions. And Joanne, if you could close the webinar, that'd be great. Thank you.
I will close the webinar, but I first want to say, Daisy, thank you so much for sharing all of this work with us. It's so exciting. And I can see from the comments and the questions that there's a lot of interest here in developing a palette for North America and for New England in particular. And I want to let you all know that we are talking with Daisy now about the possibility of establishing one of these pollinator path maker gardens on one of the trustees' properties. So stay tuned for that. I also want to encourage you all to visit all of our public gardens and all of our properties, and to, in particular, if you're interested in learning more about pollinators and gardening itself, check out the Long Hill website. The programs here for gardeners and for anyone interested in nature have really ramped up. The team here is developing an incredible series of programs and workshops to help inform you and guide you in your choices for gardening. So please tune into that. And again, keep an eye on the things that are happening at our public gardens, our bulb shows, our plant sales, and our other ways that we are trying to help you connect to nature. Thank you all so much.